as boy makes a strange hand sign on a plane, catching the stewardess's eye. Within moments, her face turns pale and she screams, "Nobody leave the plane!" Passengers are stunned as the flight is rerouted, and the mystery boy refuses to speak. But when authorities uncover falsified passports and the boy's haunting secret, one woman steps forward to help him and discovers a shocking truth that could save lives or cost her everything. What is he running from, and who is still chasing him? This is a story of courage, survival, and the fight for justice that will leave you breathless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Claire Whitman drummed her fingers on her passport, the steady rhythm matching her racing heartbeat. The early morning bustle of JFK International Airport swirled around her as she sat at gate B23, watching travelers rush past with their rolling suitcases and steaming coffee cups. She flipped through her itinerary again, even though she'd memorized every detail of her flight to Italy. The crisp pages crinkled under her fingers as she double-checked her connection in Rome, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Gate B23 to Rome, now boarding priority passengers and those needing special assistance, the gate agent announced over the speaker, her voice echoing through the terminal. A handful of elderly passengers rose slowly from their seats, gathering their belongings. Claire checked her boarding pass one more time. Group 3. She'd have to wait a bit longer. After 30 years as a school principal, she'd gotten used to being in control. But here she was, just another passenger, about to embark on her first international adventure since retirement. Her hands smoothed over her carefully pressed slacks, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. The fabric was cool and familiar under her palms, grounding her in the moment. When her group was finally called, Claire joined the line, clutching her carry-on bag close. The jet bridge seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step bringing a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The smell of jet fuel and recycled air filled her nostrils. Inside the plane, she found her window seat easily enough, 14A. As she tucked her bag under the seat in front, making sure her novel was within easy reach, movement across the aisle caught her eye. A small boy slipped into seat 14C, his oversized blue sweater hanging off one shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. What struck Claire most was his worn backpack. He held it against his chest like a shield, his knuckles white from gripping the straps so tightly. His dark eyes darted around the cabin, never settling in one place for long. The fabric of his sweater was pilled and stretched, as if it had been washed too many times, the collar frayed at the edges. Something about his demeanor made Claire's teacher instincts tingle. The boy's clothes didn't quite fit, the sweater clearly meant for someone much larger, his jeans rolled up several times at the ankles. His sneakers were scuffed and dirty, with a hole forming near the big toe of the left shoe. A thin silver chain peeked out from under his sweater collar, disappearing beneath the fabric. "Hi there. Are you traveling alone?" Claire asked softly, leaning slightly across the aisle, keeping her voice gentle and warm, the same tone she'd used countless times with nervous students in her office. The boy's eyes flickered to her face for just a moment before dropping to the floor. His fingers moved to the zipper of his backpack, pulling it back and forth nervously. He didn't answer, just hunched his shoulders more, making himself smaller in the seat. A slight tremor ran through his small frame, and she noticed a small scar near his temple, partially hidden by his dark hair. Claire watched as he started fidgeting more intensely with the zipper, his hands trembling slightly. She recognized the signs of anxiety from her years working with children, but something about this felt different, more urgent, more concerning. The way he kept glancing toward the front of the plane reminded her of a trapped animal looking for escape. His breathing seemed shallow and quick, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the baggy sweater. As the plane began to taxi, she could hear him muttering under his breath, too quiet to make out the words, though they had a rhythmic quality that suggested prayer. Claire tried to focus on the safety demonstration, on the excitement of her upcoming Italian adventure, but her eyes kept drifting back to the boy across the aisle, his nervous energy impossible to ignore. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seatbelts and overhead bins, but none seemed to notice the distressed child in 14C, who seemed to shrink further into his seat with each passing moment. Claire's eyes drifted from the pages of her mystery novel to the rigid, uneasy form of Amir beside her. The boy had not relaxed since the plane had taken off, his small hands constantly adjusting the frayed straps of his backpack. She noticed how his eyes darted from one passenger to the next, like a frightened animal searching for any potential predators. "Would you like some juice?" Claire heard a kind stewardess ask Amir softly. The boy shook his head, pressing himself further into his seat, desperate to disappear from view. Trying to give Amir the space he seemed to need, Claire returned her attention to her book. However, the words on the page blurred together as her mind wandered, years of experience working with troubled children making it hard for her to ignore the clear signs of distress beside her. Suddenly, Amir straightened up, his whole body alert and tense. His hands began moving in distinct patterns, 3 quick taps on his chest, followed by crossing his wrists. He repeated the gesture, staring intently at the stewardess as she passed by. The stewardess stopped dead in her tracks, all the color draining from her face as her drink cart was forgotten. Her eyes met Claire's for a brief moment before she hurried toward the front of the plane, her hands shaking as she grabbed the intercom phone. Hushed whispers drifted from the galley, and moments later the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected situation, we will be making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened." Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin, and a man behind Claire muttered to his seatmate, "Emergency landing? But everything seems fine." Claire glanced at Amir again, and her heart ached to see the boy had pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible. His backpack was clutched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Are you okay?" Claire whispered gently, leaning slightly closer. Amir's only response was to turn his face away, pressing it against the window as the plane began its descent. The stewardess returned, her professional composure barely masking the anxiety that radiated from her. Standing at the front of the cabin, she gripped the back of a seat to steady herself. "Nobody leave the plane," she announced, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound authoritative. Claire felt her heart pounding against her ribs as a heavy, oppressive tension filled the cabin, leaving everyone on edge and uncertain about what was to come. As the plane descended, Claire's thoughts raced. What had caused such a sudden reaction? She looked at Amir again, his small frame trembling with fear. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but she knew words would be meaningless right now. Instead, she reached out, gently placing her hand on his, offering silent support. Amir didn't pull away this time. Instead, he clung to her hand, his eyes shut tight as if willing the world to disappear. The plane finally touched down with a jolt, and the passengers let out a collective sigh of relief. The stewardess's voice came over the intercom once more, instructing everyone to remain seated as the authorities boarded. Claire's heart raced even faster. What could Amir have signaled? What danger had they narrowly escaped? Moments later, uniformed officers entered the cabin, their expressions serious. They moved swiftly, scanning the faces of the passengers until their eyes landed on Amir and Claire. One officer approached them, his tone gentle but firm. "Ma'am, we need to speak with the boy." Claire nodded, her grip on Amir's hand tightening. "It's okay, Amir," she whispered. "They're here to help." Amir's eyes fluttered open, filled with a mix of fear and hope. He took a deep breath and nodded, ready to face whatever came next, knowing he wasn't alone. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, its tires squealing against the wet tarmac of the small regional airport. Inside the cramped cabin, worried whispers rippled through the air like waves, growing more intense with each passing moment. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, shooting furtive glances toward the front of the plane. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs as she watched 3 police officers board the plane, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, their faces set with determination. "Everyone please remain seated," announced the lead officer, his voice firm but calm, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. The other passengers fell into an uneasy silence, the only sound the soft hum of the plane's idling engines. The officers moved purposefully through the narrow aisle toward Amir. Claire noticed how the young boy seemed to shrink even smaller in his oversized clothes. pressing himself against the window as if trying to disappear into it. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his worn backpack, his fingers trembling slightly. The fabric of his too large sweater bunched around his thin shoulders as he curled inward. One officer, a woman with kind eyes and gentle features, crouched beside Amir's seat. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and when she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of a summer breeze. "Hey there," she said softly, her tone warm and reassuring. "We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" Amir's only response was to squeeze his eyes shut and hold his backpack tighter, his shoulders hunching forward protectively. A small whimper escaped his lips, barely audible above the ambient noise of the cabin. The stewardess stepped forward, speaking in hushed tones to the lead officer, her face etched with concern. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but her hands fidgeted nervously with her scarf as she spoke. "He used a specific hand signal. It's one we're trained to recognize. It's associated with trafficking victims seeking help. He made it 3 times during the flight." Claire watched intently as other officers moved through the cabin, checking passports with methodical precision. They stopped at several seats, and soon 4 passengers stood in the aisle, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek, turned toward Amir and spoke in a language Claire didn't understand. The words seemed to slice through the air like a knife, dripping with malice. His eyes blazed with barely contained rage. Amir's whole body jerked as if he'd been shocked by electricity. He started trembling violently, tears forming in his dark eyes and threatening to spill over. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, and he pressed himself even harder against the window. Without thinking, Claire rose from her seat, her maternal instincts taking over. Her hands were steady even as her heart raced beneath her cream-colored blouse. "Wait," she called out to the officers, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He's terrified. Maybe he'd feel safer talking to me. I was a school principal for 30 years. I've worked with frightened children before." The officers exchanged meaningful glances, considering her offer. The female officer nodded slowly and gestured for Claire to approach, her expression softening with understanding. The other officers maintained their vigilant watch over the detained passengers. Claire moved carefully to Amir's row, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, like approaching a wounded animal. She sat in the empty seat next to him, maintaining a respectful distance while offering a reassuring presence. The worn leather of the seat creaked softly beneath her. Amir's eyes darted between her and the officers before he leaned closer to her, his body still shaking. His voice came out as barely a whisper, broken and desperate. "Please, don't let them take me. Please help me." The words carried the weight of unspoken horrors. The raw fear in his voice made Claire's chest tighten painfully. She could smell the faint scent of airplane coffee and feel the subtle vibration of the idling engines beneath her feet as she realized that her peaceful trip to Italy had transformed into something far more serious, something that would change both their lives forever. The small holding room felt sterile and cold, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and blank white walls that seemed to close in around them. Claire watched as Amir perched uneasily on the edge of his chair, his fingers white-knuckled around his worn backpack straps, the fabric frayed from constant clutching. 2 uniformed officers stood near the door, their expressions neutral but watchful, their radios occasionally crackling with muffled voices while another sat across from them, his voice gentle but firm despite the late hour showing on the wall clock. "Can you tell us where you're from?" the officer asked, pen hovering over his notepad. Amir's eyes darted to the floor, his shoulders hunching forward like a protective shell, making himself as small as possible in the metal chair that seemed too big for his slight frame. Claire's chest tightened at his obvious fear, her heart aching for him. She'd seen similar behavior in troubled students during her years as principal, though never quite this severe or raw. The boy's terror was almost palpable in the room. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she turned slightly in her uncomfortable metal chair to face him, careful not to make any sudden movements. "My name is Claire," she said softly, choosing her words with care, her tone warm and motherly. "I was a school principal for 30 years before I retired last spring." She smiled warmly, trying to project the same calming presence that had helped countless students through difficult times, from failed tests to family troubles. I worked with lots of kids your age. Some of them were scared too, but they learned they could trust me. Amir's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment, a brief flash of connection before retreating, like a frightened animal testing the safety of its surroundings. "Would you like some water?" Claire asked, keeping her voice steady and calm, gesturing to the paper cup on the table between them. When he didn't respond, she continued gently. "You know, I always kept a jar of candy in my office. The butterscotch ones were everyone's favorite. Even the most nervous students would usually take one. Sometimes we'd just sit quietly and enjoy the candy together." After several minutes of Claire's gentle chatter about her school days and the children she'd helped, Amir's rigid posture softened slightly, his death grip on the backpack loosening just a fraction. His whisper was barely audible, like a leaf rustling in the wind. "Amir." "That's a beautiful name," Claire replied warmly, resisting the urge to reach out and touch his arm. But Amir fell silent again, his thin shoulders tensing as he refused to answer any other questions, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. The lead officer, Detective Morris, pulled Claire aside while his partner stayed with Amir, maintaining a respectful distance. His weathered face showed concern as he spoke quietly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "He seems to trust you more than anyone else we've seen," he said in hushed tones, running a hand through his graying hair. "We'd like your help staying with him temporarily. I have to warn you, though, this could be dangerous. We believe he's involved in a trafficking case." Claire glanced back at Amir, who was watching them with worried eyes that seemed too old for his young face, his fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on his backpack. Her planned vacation to Italy, with its art museums and cafes, seemed trivial compared to this boy's desperate need. Still, the weight of the responsibility gave her pause, making her stomach flutter with uncertainty, her practical side warring with her instinct to help. "What exactly would you need me to do?" she asked, twisting her silver watch band nervously, a habit she'd developed over years of dealing with difficult situations at school. "Just stay with him, try to get him to open up," Detective Morris explained, his tone reassuring but serious, his eyes conveying the gravity of the situation. "We'll provide protection and a safe location, but we need to know what he knows." Claire nodded slowly, her protective instincts winning out over her hesitation as she watched the frightened boy, remembering all the children she'd helped through the years. None had seemed quite as desperate as Amir. When the officers stepped out to make arrangements, their footsteps echoing in the hallway like distant thunder, Amir shifted closer to Claire, as if drawn to her warmth. His voice trembled like a frightened bird as he whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. "They'll come for me." A chill ran down Claire's spine as she looked at the frightened boy beside her, his words hanging heavy in the sterile air of the holding room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the fear etched across his young face. The secure room felt cold and sterile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Claire pulled a thin blanket over Amir's shoulders as he curled up on the small cot, his backpack clutched tightly against his chest. His breathing eventually steadied into the rhythm of sleep, though his face remained tense, his fingers twitching occasionally. Every few minutes, a small shudder ran through his body, as if even in sleep he couldn't fully escape his fears. Dark shadows under his eyes spoke of many sleepless nights. Claire settled into the hard plastic chair nearby, trying to find a comfortable position. The events of the day swirled in her mind like autumn leaves caught in a windstorm. Her planned vacation to Italy seemed like a distant dream now. She had imagined herself strolling through sun-drenched piazzas, not sitting in a police station watching over a traumatized child. The plane ticket in her purse felt like it belonged to another lifetime, another person. A soft whimper from Amir drew her attention. In his fitful sleep, his grip had loosened slightly, and Claire noticed something she hadn't seen before. A crumpled piece of paper peeking out from his clenched fist. The corner was worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times, the edges soft and fraying from constant handling. Tiny creases crisscrossed the visible portion like a road map of worry. Moving quietly, Claire leaned forward. With gentle fingers, she carefully eased the paper from his grasp. Her heart pounded as she smoothed out the creased sheet. Strange symbols covered the page, circles, squares, and triangles arranged in peculiar patterns. Between them were strings of numbers, written in a hurried, shaky hand. Some of the ink was smudged, as if tears had fallen on the page. The paper itself felt delicate, ready to tear at the well-worn folds. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to herself, squinting at the mysterious markings. The symbols seemed to dance before her eyes, holding secrets she desperately wanted to understand. Each mark felt deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. A sudden movement startled her. Amir's eyes flew open wide with terror as he spotted the paper in her hands. "No!" he cried out, bolting upright. "Give it back!" His voice cracked with panic, his whole body trembling. His hands reached out desperately, fingers grasping at the air. I'm so sorry," Claire said quickly, holding out the paper. Amir snatched it back, his hands trembling. "I shouldn't have looked without asking. I just want to help you, Amir." She kept her voice soft and steady, though her heart ached at his fear, her palms raised in a gesture of peace. He clutched the paper to his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow. Claire stayed perfectly still, giving him space to calm down. In the quiet that followed, she remembered something that had caught her attention earlier. The name he'd mumbled repeatedly in his troubled sleep, each time with such longing. "Amir," she said softly. "Who is Layla? You mentioned that name in your sleep." The boy's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the world pressed down on them. He stared at the paper in his hands, running his thumb over the creased edge. The silence stretched between them like a taut rubber band. His eyes grew distant, filled with a mixture of love and profound sadness. A single tear traced down his cheek. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "My sister." Claire's heart ached at the pain in those two simple words. She watched as Amir carefully tucked the paper back into his backpack, his movements precise and protective, as if handling something infinitely precious. When he lay down again, he pulled the blanket tight around himself, creating a barrier between himself and the world. But now she understood. The paper wasn't just a collection of mysterious symbols. It was his link to Layla, and perhaps his only hope of finding her. The way he guarded it told her everything about how much his sister meant to him. Sunlight streamed through the narrow window of the secure facility, casting long shadows across the small breakfast table. Claire watched as Amir pushed his scrambled eggs around the plate with his fork, his shoulders hunched. The plastic utensils scraped against the cheap disposable plate, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The institutional beige walls seemed to close in around them, making the space feel even smaller than it was. A clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking each heavy moment of silence. "Would you like something else?" Claire asked softly, trying to catch his eye. "Maybe some toast? Or there might be some fruit in the kitchen. You need to keep up your strength." Amir shook his head, then suddenly lifted his gaze to meet hers. His dark eyes were filled with unshed tears, the morning light catching the moisture gathering at their corners. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his fork. "They came at night," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Men in a big truck. They said we were going somewhere special. Said our parents knew about it, that they'd see us soon." Claire's heart clenched, but she kept her expression calm and encouraging, years of experience with troubled children helping her maintain her composure. She leaned forward slightly, showing she was listening. "We? You mean you and Layla?" Amir nodded, his lower lip trembling. "They put us in different places. I could hear Layla crying, calling my name." His fingers twisted the hem of his oversized shirt, pulling at a loose thread. A tear finally escaped, rolling down his cheek. "They made us work all day. No school, no playing. Just work and work. If we stopped, they—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence, his small frame shuddering at the memory. Claire reached across the table, offering her hand palm up. After a moment's hesitation, Amir placed his small hand in hers, his fingers cold and slightly shaking. The touch seemed to give him courage to continue. "The note," he continued, glancing at his backpack in the corner where it sat like a guardian of secrets. I found it in the office where they kept our papers. There were numbers and symbols. Layla taught me what they meant before. His voice cracked and he blinked rapidly to hold back tears, his free hand wiping roughly at his eyes. Before Claire could respond, the door opened with a soft click. A police officer stepped in, her face serious, her badge catching the morning light. Her boots made soft sounds on the linoleum floor as she approached. "Ms. Whitman, we have an update." She glanced at Amir, then back to Claire, her expression grave. "Most of the suspects are in custody, but we had to release one. Insufficient evidence to hold him." Claire felt Amir's hand turn ice cold in hers. His face drained of color, becoming almost ashen, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The half-eaten breakfast lay forgotten on the table, steam no longer rising from the cooling eggs. "He'll find me," Amir whispered, terror evident in every syllable. His eyes grew wide with panic. "He knows I took the paper. He'll come for me. He always finds people who run. Always." Claire squeezed his hand gently and placed her other hand on his shoulder, trying to provide comfort. But Amir's eyes were wide with fear, darting between the door and window, as if expecting the man to appear at any moment. His whole body trembled under her touch like a frightened bird. "The scarred man," he whimpered, shrinking further into his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. "He's the one who knows where Layla is, and now he's free. He's the one who separated us. He's the one who—" His words dissolved into quiet sobs. The officer shifted uncomfortably by the door, her hand resting instinctively on her weapon. Her expression softened with sympathy. "We'll maintain surveillance on the released suspect, but legally, our hands are tied without more evidence." Amir's trembling intensified. His free hand clutched at his chest, where Claire knew the precious note was hidden in an inner pocket of his shirt. The paper crinkled softly under his grip. "He'll find me," he repeated, his voice breaking. "And then I'll never see Layla again. Never." Claire's hands trembled uncontrollably as she watched Amir pace back and forth across the small room, his sneakers making soft scuffing sounds against the worn carpet. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he moved, his shoulders hunched with worry. The note burned in her mind like a hot coal. Those mysterious symbols, hastily scrawled on crumpled paper, held answers they desperately needed. She stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor, startling Amir into stillness. "We can't just wait here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with concern. "That note you have, I think we should try to understand what it means. Together." Amir's eyes widened, fear and uncertainty dancing across his young face. His fingers twisted nervously at the hem of his t-shirt. "But the police said—" "I know what they said," Claire interrupted gently, moving closer to him and placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Sometimes adults need to break the rules to do what's right, to protect the people we care about." They slipped out of the building through a side door, Claire's heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The city streets were busy with afternoon traffic, cars honking and people rushing past with shopping bags and briefcases as they carefully followed the numbers from the note. Amir moved with purpose, his eyes darting from wall to wall, pointing at symbols that matched graffiti tags on walls and lampposts, leading them deeper into an industrial area where the buildings grew taller and more neglected. The air grew heavier with the smell of rust and abandonment. Finally, they stood before a massive abandoned warehouse, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at them. Broken glass crunched under their feet like frost as they approached, sending tiny echoes into the empty street. The building's skeletal frame loomed above them, its walls a chaotic canvas of spray-painted artwork and weathered brick, telling silent stories of years of abandonment. Pigeons scattered from a nearby ledge, their wings flapping noisily in the quiet. "Are you sure about this?" Claire whispered, touching Amir's shoulder with trembling fingers. A cool breeze rustled through his dark hair as he nodded firmly, clutching his backpack tighter against his chest like a shield. Inside, their footsteps echoed through empty halls, bouncing off bare walls and exposed pipes. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light filtering through broken windows, A voice made them freeze mid-step. I was wondering when someone would figure out the code. A woman emerged from the shadows, her movements cautious but deliberate. She was thin, almost fragile-looking, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, but her gaze was sharp and alert, taking in every detail. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, but they were clean and carefully maintained. "I'm Zara," she said, keeping her distance, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. "And you must be Amir. I remember your sister. She never stopped talking about you." Amir stepped forward eagerly, hope lighting up his face like a sunrise. "You know Layla?" Zara nodded, a flicker of pain crossing her features. Her fingers absently traced a faded scar on her wrist. "We were together for a while. I worked for them, but not by choice. Those symbols you have?" She pointed to Amir's note with a slightly shaking hand. "It's their system, how they organize everything. Moving people, scheduling, drop-off points. I learned it all. Had to survive somehow." Claire studied Zara carefully, looking for any sign of deception in the woman's tired face. "Can you help us find Layla?" "I can try, but—" Zara suddenly stiffened, her whole body going rigid as her eyes darted to a grimy window. The sound of gravel crunching under tires filtered in from outside. "Someone's watching. They must have followed you here." Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper, laced with genuine fear. "We need to leave. Now. They don't like it when people ask questions." Back at the safe house, Claire paced the small room while Amir huddled in a corner chair, his fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. The fading afternoon light cast strange shadows through the grimy windows, making the cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. Zara stood by the window, her slim figure casting a long shadow across the worn carpet as she scanned the street below, tension visible in every line of her body. "Someone's watching the building," Zara whispered, her fingers twitching against the dusty curtain. "A black sedan. It's been parked there for 20 minutes. 2 men inside, and they're not even pretending to look casual." Claire studied her carefully, noting every subtle movement and expression. There was something in Zara's eyes, a haunted look that spoke of dark memories and sleepless nights. The weight of those memories seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But could they trust her? The stakes were too high for mistakes, and one wrong move could cost them everything. Amir cleared his throat. She did work with Layla," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands twisted together in his lap as he spoke. "I remember seeing her once when they moved us between buildings. She gave Layla extra water when no one was looking, and a blanket too when it was cold." Zara turned from the window, her face etched with pain and regret. "I was brought in as a cleaner 2 years ago, but once I saw what was happening to those children—" She wrapped her arms around herself as if warding off a chill. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "I started keeping records, memorizing patterns, learning their codes. I couldn't just walk away. Those kids needed someone, anyone, to care." Claire sat down next to Amir, instinctively placing a protective hand on his shoulder. She felt him lean slightly into her touch, seeking comfort. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "The network has people everywhere. Police, government, even schools. I've seen them silence witnesses before." Zara moved to the table where Amir's crumpled note lay, smoothing it carefully with trembling fingers. "These symbols, they're part of their location system. Each combination represents a different safe house or transfer point. They change them monthly, but I've memorized the patterns. Had to. Writing anything down was too dangerous." Claire watched as Zara's fingers traced the markings, her movements precise and practiced. Despite her reservations, she couldn't deny that Zara's knowledge seemed genuine. The woman's eyes held a fierce determination that matched her own. "Can you help us decode the rest?" "Yes." Zara pulled out a pen and paper from her jacket pocket, her movements quick and efficient. "This triangle with 3 dots? That's their symbol for warehouse districts, and these numbers correspond to specific zones in the city. See how they overlap? That's intentional, to confuse anyone who might intercept the messages. They're clever, but predictable if you know what to look for." As they worked through the symbols, Claire noticed Amir leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the emerging pattern of locations. Hope flickered across his face for the first time since she'd met him, replacing his usual fearful expression. His fingers drummed quietly against his knee, no longer pulling at loose threads. Looking at his expression, Claire made her decision. The risks were enormous, but they needed Zara's help. Sometimes trust wasn't about certainty. It was about taking the chance that could make all the difference between success and failure. The memory of Amir's unwavering faith in finding his sister steeled her resolve. "Okay," Claire said, spreading out a city map on the rickety table. The old wood creaked under the pressure. "Show us exactly where these symbols lead." Zara nodded, relief visible in her expression as her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for trusting me." She began marking locations on the map, her hand steady and sure as she worked, explaining each mark with quiet confidence. Her pen moved with purpose, drawing circles and arrows that connected the scattered points into a clear pattern. "We're running out of time," Claire said, glancing at Amir's worried face. The sun was sinking lower, painting the room in deep orange hues. "Let's find your sister." Dawn's first light crept through the safe house windows, casting long shadows across the worn floor. Claire zipped up a small backpack, her fingers trembling as she checked their meager supplies. Some water bottles, granola bars, and a first aid kit. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of their situation pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Amir stood by the window, his small frame tense as he peered through a gap in the curtains. His worn backpack remained clutched to his chest, the precious note safely tucked inside. The note was his lifeline, a promise that his sister Layla was out there waiting for him. Zara paced nearby, checking her phone every few minutes with growing unease. Her brow furrowed deeper with each glance at the screen. "Something's wrong," Zara muttered, frowning at her phone. "We should—" A thunderous knock cut through the quiet morning, sending a jolt of fear through Claire. Her heart leaped into her throat and she froze, her breath catching. Zara immediately pressed a finger to her lips, motioning them all to stay still. The room fell silent except for the pounding at the door. Bang! The door flew open with shocking force, slamming against the wall. Heavy boots thundered across the floor as men in police uniforms stormed inside. Zara's eyes widened in recognition, her face paling. "It's them," she hissed. "The traffickers." Claire grabbed Amir's hand tightly and followed Zara toward the back of the safe house. The false officers shouted commands, their voices echoing off the walls, cold and menacing. Claire could hear them ransacking rooms behind them as they fled, the sound of breaking glass and overturned furniture sending shivers down her spine. They burst through the back door into a narrow alley. The morning air was crisp and cold against Claire's face as they ran, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep up with Zara's pace. She glanced back to make sure Amir was close, his small hand still clasped in hers. A shout from behind made Claire's blood run cold. "There they are!" They rounded a corner, feet pounding against wet pavement. Claire glanced back again to check on Amir, but he wasn't there. Her heart stopped, and a wave of panic crashed over her. "Amir!" she screamed, spinning around. "Amir!" Zara grabbed her arm with surprising strength, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stop! If they hear us, it's over." "But he's gone." Claire tried to wrench free, panic rising in her chest like a wildfire. "We have to—" "They'll kill us all if they catch us," Zara insisted, pulling Claire into the shadow of a dumpster. "We can't help him if we're dead." Claire slumped against the alley wall, tears streaming down her face. Her voice came out as a broken whisper, choked with fear and despair. "We have to find him." Zara nodded grimly, her eyes reflecting the same determination. And fast. The sound of running boots and shouted commands echoed in the distance as they caught their breath in the narrow alley. Claire stared back toward the safe house, her heart breaking for the frightened boy who had trusted her to protect him. The thought of Amir alone and scared tore at her, fueling her resolve to find him no matter what. Claire burst into the police station, her hair windswept and clothes rumpled from their hasty escape. Zara followed close behind, her eyes darting around the busy precinct, taking in every detail. "I need to speak with the detective in charge of Amir's case now." Claire's voice carried across the bustling room, drawing several curious glances and murmurs. A tall man in a crisp suit approached them, his expression serious. "I'm Detective Morales. Let's—" Claire's hands trembled as she emptied Amir's backpack onto the small desk. The temporary shelter felt cramped, with its bare walls and single window where Zara kept watch. A few worn t-shirts, a toothbrush, and some candy wrappers spilled out. The musty scent of unwashed clothes filled the air, reminding Claire of how long the boy had been on the run. "There has to be something we missed," Claire muttered, smoothing each item carefully. She turned each piece of clothing inside out, checking every seam and pocket with methodical precision. Zara paused her pacing to peek through the dusty blinds again, her shoulders tense. "We need to be careful. They could be watching." A car drove past slowly, making them both hold their breath until it disappeared around the corner. Claire picked up the crumpled note, holding it under the desk lamp. Her eyes widened as something caught her attention. "Zara, come look at this." In the bright light, faint numbers appeared in the margins, previously invisible in natural light. These weren't visible before. The digits, written in what looked like lemon juice or some other clear substance, glowed faintly under the harsh lamp. Zara rushed over, her face inches from the paper. "These are coordinates," she said, her voice tight with recognition. "They point to Wilson's shipping yard, on the industrial side of town." She grabbed her phone, pulling up a map. "It's a known smuggling hub. I've heard whispers about it during my time undercover. The place is like a fortress, chain-link fences topped with razor wire, guard dogs, the works." Claire immediately called Detective Morales, her fingers drumming anxiously on the desk as she waited. The ringtone seemed to last forever. When he answered, she quickly explained their discovery, the words tumbling out in her urgency. "That yard is dangerous territory," Morales warned. "It's heavily monitored by some very bad people. We've had our eye on it, but getting close is nearly impossible. They've got lookouts everywhere, and they're not afraid to use force." "We don't have time to wait," Claire insisted, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "Every minute we delay puts Amir at greater risk." She thought of his frightened face, his trust in her, and felt her resolve strengthen. Zara stopped her pacing and placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. "You know, you're braver than most. Most people would have walked away by now." Her eyes held a mix of admiration and concern. Claire folded the note carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. The weight of the paper felt like both a burden and a promise. Zara nodded, checking her weapon one last time. "We'll find him." The determination in her voice matched Claire's own resolve. The shipping yard loomed before them, a maze of metal containers stretching into darkness like a giant's abandoned playground. Claire pulled her jacket tighter against the biting night air as she crouched behind a stack of wooden crates with Zara and Detective Morales. Harsh floodlights cast long shadows across the cracked concrete, making every movement seem threatening, and every rustle of wind feel like an approaching enemy. "There," Zara whispered, pointing to a row of rust-streaked containers. "Those markings match Amir's note exactly, the same pattern he drew." Claire's heart jumped into her throat as she spotted a group of men approaching one of the marked containers. They moved with practiced efficiency, their gestures quick and precise as they directed a forklift to load it onto a waiting truck. The metal groaned under its own weight as it was lifted. "Stay low," Detective Morales warned, his hand steady on his radio, eyes never leaving the scene before them. "We need to follow that truck without being spotted. One wrong move could blow everything." They crept along the edge of the yard, using the deep shadows for cover. Claire's legs burned from staying crouched, but raw fear kept her moving forward. The rhythmic beeping of the forklift echoed through the yard, bouncing off containers and masking their careful footsteps. Suddenly, Claire's phone slipped from her jacket pocket, clattering on the concrete with a sound that seemed to explode in the quiet night. One of the traffickers whirled around, his hand moving instinctively to his waist where a weapon surely waited. Before Claire could even draw a breath, Zara snatched up a loose rock and threw it far to their left with perfect aim. It clattered against some metal drums, the noise echoing through the yard and drawing the traffickers' attention away from their position. Claire pressed herself against the cold container, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it would give them away. The trafficker investigated the noise with suspicious eyes, sweeping his flashlight across the area before finally returning to his work. Minutes that felt like hours later, the truck's engine rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They hurried back to their surveillance van, keeping to the shadows, following at a safe distance as the truck pulled away from the yard. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white against the worn fabric. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool night air. "We're getting closer," she whispered, hope flickering in her eyes like a tiny flame refusing to be extinguished. "We're coming for you, Amir." The surveillance van idled in the shadows as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Claire's fingers drummed nervously against her knee as she watched the truck maneuver into the depot's receiving area. Her throat felt dry, knowing Amir might be just yards away, separated only by concrete walls and metal gates. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. "They're logging the cargo now," Detective Morales whispered, adjusting his headphones, his weathered face illuminated by the dim glow of monitoring equipment. Through binoculars, they could see workers with clipboards moving around the truck, checking numbers against their lists with mechanical efficiency. Each mark they made could represent another life about to disappear. The crackle of a radio broke the tense silence. A gruff voice cut through the static. "Everything's set. Shipment leaves tonight." The words hung heavy in the air like a death sentence. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Detective Morales leaned forward, his expression grim, deep lines etching his forehead. "They're planning to move them by sea. Once that happens..." He shook his head, leaving the dire implications unspoken. "Then we need to act now," Claire insisted, her voice tight with urgency, fingers gripping the edge of her seat. "We can't let them get Amir onto that ship." The image of the young boy trapped in a dark container at sea made her physically ill. Detective Morales held up his hand. "We need to do this right. My team is still an hour out. Going in without proper backup would be suicide." His tone carried years of experience and the weight of past operations gone wrong. "An hour?" Claire's voice rose, panic threading through her words. "They could move him before then. We don't have time to wait." Zara, who had been quietly observing from the back of the van, spoke up. "She's right. I've seen how quickly they operate. Once they start moving people onto ships, it's nearly impossible to track them." Her voice carried the haunting knowledge of someone who'd witnessed such disappearances firsthand. "I understand the urgency," Morales replied, "but we need to be smart about this. One wrong move and..." "Every minute we wait puts Amir at greater risk," Claire interrupted, her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. "We've come too far to lose him now." Zara moved closer, her eyes intense and pleading. "Detective, I know these people. They won't hesitate to disappear the moment they sense trouble. Waiting for reinforcements might mean losing our only chance." She gestured toward the depot's growing activity. Claire watched the depot through the van's window, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice resolute. "We have to stop them tonight." The morning sun now cast long shadows across the depot's yard, each passing minute bringing them closer to disaster. The night air hung heavy with salt and diesel as Claire, Zara, and Morales crouched behind a stack of empty pallets at the dockyard's edge. Floodlights cast harsh shadows between the towering rows of shipping containers, while waves crashed rhythmically against the pier below. The distant hum of cargo ships and the occasional seagull's cry provided cover for their whispered conversation. "Remember," Morales whispered, checking his radio and adjusting his bulletproof vest, "my team is positioned around the perimeter. At the first sign of trouble, we move in. Keep your phones on silent." Claire nodded, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat as she watched armed guards patrol the maze of containers. Their boots scraped against the concrete as they made their rounds. She and Zara split from Morales, staying low as they weaved through the narrow passages between the metal giants. careful to avoid the pools of light that could give them away. "There," Zara breathed, pointing to a container marked with the familiar symbol from Amir's note, 3 parallel lines crossed by a diagonal slash. Claire's hope turned to frustration when they reached it. Thick chains and reinforced locks secured the doors, far too robust for any quick solution. "We'll never break through this," Claire whispered, running her fingers along the cold metal, feeling the rough texture of rust beneath her fingertips. Zara's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the area, her expression shifting from concerned to determined. "I have an idea," she said quietly, tugging at her sleeve. "But you won't like it." "What do you mean?" "We need someone with keys," Zara explained, her voice barely above a breath. "I can create a distraction, pretend to be lost, maybe looking for work, draw them away from their posts. These types always let their guard down around women they think are vulnerable." Claire grabbed Zara's arm, her fingers digging in with worry. "That's too dangerous. If they recognize you—" "They won't," Zara insisted, gently pulling free. "I know how to play this role. While they're focused on me, you can check if anyone's inside the container. Just knock quietly. If Amir's in there, he'll respond. He knows to listen for help." Claire's stomach churned at the thought of Zara putting herself at risk. But as another patrol passed nearby, their flashlight beams sweeping the ground, she knew they were running out of options and time. "Okay," Claire finally agreed, her voice tight with concern. "But at the first sign of trouble—" "I'll run," Zara promised, squeezing Claire's hand reassuringly. "Hide behind that container there. Wait for my signal. I'll drop my scarf." Claire pressed herself into the shadows of a nearby container, her breath shallow and her muscles tense as she watched Zara straighten her clothes and walk purposefully toward a group of traffickers near the water's edge. The sound of the waves seemed to grow louder, matching the rushing of blood in her ears. The night air crackled with tension as Zara approached the traffickers, her steps purposefully uncertain, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice wavering just the right amount to seem genuinely nervous. "I heard some strange noises over here. I'm supposed to be checking inventory. My supervisor will be angry if I don't." 2 burly men turned toward her, their faces hard in the dim light as their hands slid beneath their jackets. "This area's restricted," one growled, taking an intimidating step forward. "Oh, I'm sorry," Zara stammered, backing away slightly, playing up her anxiety. "It's just that my supervisor said to check every container in this section. He was really specific about it." She gestured toward the locked container, wringing her hands. The men exchanged suspicious glances. One pulled out a ring of keys, moving toward the container with slow, deliberate steps. "Let's see what's got you so concerned. Then we can all get back to work." The lock clicked open, and Claire burst from her hiding spot like a coiled spring. She slammed into the first man while Zara tackled the second, using the element of surprise to their advantage. They struggled briefly, a desperate tangle of limbs and grunts before subduing the surprised traffickers with practiced moves. Claire yanked the container doors wide, her hands shaking with urgency. Her heart leaped when she saw Amir huddled in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, looking smaller than ever. Tears streaked his dirty face, cutting clean paths through the grime. "Amir," she whispered, rushing to him, her own eyes filling with tears. He threw himself into her arms with desperate force, sobbing uncontrollably. "I thought you left me," he choked out between ragged breaths. "Never," Claire promised, holding him tight against her chest. "I'll never leave you. You're safe now." Zara appeared at the doorway, her expression urgent. "We need to move. Now. More guards could show up any second." Claire helped Amir to his feet, supporting his trembling body as they hurried from the container. But angry shouts erupted behind them. More guards had spotted them from across the yard. Claire's blood ran cold as she heard running footsteps approaching, getting louder with each second. Suddenly, flashlights blazed from every direction and authoritative voices boomed. "Police! Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" Morales and his team swarmed the area like a well-oiled machine. The night exploded into chaos as officers clashed with traffickers, orders and shouts filling the air. Claire pulled Amir behind a stack of wooden crates, shielding him with her body, as the sound of scuffling and handcuffs clicking echoed around them. "We're almost out of here," she whispered, feeling him tremble against her side. "Stay close to me. Don't let go of my hand." The night air crackled with tension as Claire held Amir close behind the steel crates. Gunfire echoed through the dockyard, making them both flinch with each sharp report. The acrid smell of cordite hung heavy in the air. Zara crouched beside them, her eyes darting between shadows cast by the harsh floodlights that cut through the darkness like searchlights. "We need to move," Zara whispered, pointing to a gap between containers. "Stay low and follow my lead." Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she guided Amir forward, feeling the rough concrete scrape against her palms. The boy trembled but remained silent, his fingers gripping her sleeve so tightly, his knuckles turned white. They could hear Morales shouting commands to his team, their footsteps thundering across the concrete like a stampede. Suddenly, Amir tugged at Claire's arm with desperate urgency. His eyes were fixed on a nearby crate marked with familiar symbols, the same ones from his note. His breath caught in his throat. "There," he whispered urgently. "Look, those markings." Zara hesitated, glancing between the crate and their escape route, sweat beading on her forehead. Another burst of gunfire made them duck lower, the sound reverberating off the metal containers. "We don't have time," she started, but Amir was already moving with surprising determination. "Please," he begged, his dark eyes pleading. "It's important. We have to check." Claire nodded at Zara, who quickly worked to pry open the crate's lid with practiced movements. Inside, beneath a layer of musty packing material, they found a thick leather-bound book, its cover worn and weathered. Zara flipped it open, her eyes widening in the dim light. "Names," she breathed, fingers tracing the neat rows of handwriting. "Dates, locations, payment records, everything we need." She quickly stuffed the logbook into her jacket, zipping it securely. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them scrambling for cover, their hearts racing. Through gaps in the containers, Claire could see Morales' team advancing in formation, forcing the traffickers to retreat into the shadows. The tide was turning in their favor at last. "This way," Zara motioned, leading them toward the extraction point. They moved carefully between shadows, Claire keeping Amir close against her side, as bullets pinged off metal nearby with metallic whines. The boy stayed remarkably calm, focused entirely on moving forward, his jaw set with determination. When they finally reached the designated safe area, Claire's legs gave out from underneath her. She dropped to her knees on the rough ground, pulling Amir into a tight embrace. Her whole body shook with relief and exhaustion, muscles trembling from the strain. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks as she held him, breathing in his presence. "We did it," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Zara knelt beside them, placing a steady hand on Claire's shoulder, her touch grounding and reassuring. "It's not over yet," Zara murmured, scanning the darkness around them. "But we're close. So close." Claire's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway of the safe house. Morning sunlight streamed through barred windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and fresh coffee. Amir's small hand gripped hers tightly as they followed a staff member down the corridor, his palms sweaty with anticipation. "We have some news," the counselor said softly, her kind eyes meeting Claire's. Her gentle smile held promise. "We've located Layla." Amir's grip tightened, his breath catching. A small tremor ran through his body. Claire knelt beside him, watching hope and fear dance across his tired face. The dark circles under his eyes seemed more pronounced in the harsh morning light. "Your sister is here waiting to see you." The counselor led them to a small room with pale blue walls and simple furniture. A worn stuffed animal sat forgotten in one corner, and cheerful drawings decorated a bulletin board. When the door opened, time seemed to stand still. There, standing by the window, was a young girl with the same dark eyes as Amir. Though thin and weary-looking with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, she radiated an inner strength that took Claire's breath away. "Layla!" Amir's cry broke the silence, his voice cracking with emotion. He ran forward, colliding with his sister in a desperate embrace. They collapsed to their knees, holding each other as if afraid the other might disappear. Tears streamed down both their faces as they spoke rapidly in their native language, their words tumbling over each other in a rush of love and relief. Claire watched from the doorway, her own eyes filling with tears. Her heart felt too big for her chest. The sight of these two children, finally reunited after enduring such darkness, made her heart ache with both joy and sadness. Their embrace spoke of countless nights of worry, of prayers whispered into darkness, of hope that refused to die. Layla looked up, her tear-stained face full of gratitude. Her lower lip trembled as she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered in accented English. "You saved my brother. You are an angel." Claire shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The counselor quietly explained how Layla had been working against the traffickers from within, passing information to authorities whenever possible. Her brave actions had led to her separation from Amir, but she had never stopped fighting to protect others, even at great risk to herself. "I couldn't save everyone," Layla said softly, stroking Amir's hair as he clung to her. Her fingers moved in gentle, soothing circles. "But I tried. I had to try." Exhausted from the emotional reunion, Amir's eyes began to droop. His shoulders sagged as the tension finally left his small body. Layla gathered him close, and he curled against her like a much younger child, finally allowing himself to truly rest. Claire watched as peace settled over his features for the first time since she'd met him, smoothing away the worry lines that no child should have to carry. Stepping quietly into the hallway, Claire tilted her face toward the ceiling. Sunlight warmed her skin as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart overflowing with gratitude for this moment of healing amidst so much pain. Claire sat across from Detective Morales in the Stark Police Station conference room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The metal chairs squeaked against the linoleum floor as Zara perched beside her, both women still looking tired but determined after the previous night's events. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, but there was a spark of fierce satisfaction in their expressions. "Ladies, I can't thank you enough," Morales said, spreading photos and documents across the scratched metal table. His hands moved with careful precision as he arranged the evidence. "What you accomplished at the dockyard, it's going to make a real difference. We're looking at the biggest trafficking bust this department has ever seen." Claire nodded, her thoughts drifting to Amir and Layla, now safely housed with a foster family vetted by child services. The image of their tearful smiles as they'd hugged goodbye warmed her heart. "The logbook was the key, wasn't it?" "Absolutely," Morales confirmed, tapping the evidence bag containing the worn ledger. Coffee stains marked its dog-eared pages. Names, dates, locations. It's all here. We've already identified major players in 3 countries. This is the smoking gun we needed. Zara cleared her throat, sitting up straighter. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but her voice was steady. "I want to testify," she announced firmly. "Against all of them. I know it's dangerous, but someone has to speak up. These people need to face justice." Claire turned to her, touched by her courage. "Are you sure? After everything you've been through?" "That's exactly why I have to do it," Zara replied, lifting her chin. "I've seen too much to stay quiet now. Those children deserve someone fighting for them." Morales leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. The corners of his eyes crinkled with concern. "We'll make sure you have round-the-clock protection, Zara. Witness security is our top priority. You won't have to face this alone." As they reviewed the logbook's contents, Claire felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over her. International arrest warrants were being issued, safe houses were being raided, and victims were being rescued, all because they'd refused to look the other way. Each page they turned represented another chance at freedom for someone trapped in darkness. Several arrests happened overnight, Morales explained, showing them surveillance photos of handcuffed figures being led away by authorities. Interpol is coordinating with agencies across borders. This network is coming down piece by piece. We're seeing cooperation like never before. When they finished the debriefing, Claire and Zara gathered their belongings. The morning sun streamed through the station's entrance as they prepared to leave, casting long shadows on the floor. Zara turned to Claire, a small smile playing at her lips. "You've done more than you realize," she said quietly, her eyes bright with gratitude. Claire nodded, meeting her gaze. "So have you." A week later, Claire's heart fluttered as she pulled up to a charming 2-story house with white shutters and flower boxes in the windows. The late afternoon sun caught the cheerful red geraniums, making them glow like tiny flames. Before she could even step out of her car, Amir burst through the front door, his face lit up with pure joy. "Claire, you came." He raced down the brick path and grabbed her hand, practically dragging her toward the house. His energy was completely different from the frightened boy she'd met on the plane. Now his eyes sparkled with life and his smile seemed permanent, transforming his whole face. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, filled with the smell of fresh-baked cookies and something cinnamony. Photos of smiling children lined the walls, previous foster kids who'd found safety here. Each frame told its own story of hope and new beginnings. Layla sat at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out before her, her dark hair neatly braided. She jumped up to hug Claire tightly, nearly knocking over her chair in her excitement. "Look what I'm studying." Layla proudly showed Claire her English workbook, pointing to the exercises she'd completed in neat handwriting. "I want to go to college someday, maybe become a social worker. I want to help other kids like us." Claire spent the afternoon helping Amir practice his English vocabulary, marveling at how quickly he picked up new words. His progress was remarkable. He'd already mastered basic conversations and was eager to learn more. The foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, watched from the doorway with gentle smiles, their eyes reflecting pride in their new charges. "We can't thank you enough," Mrs. Chen said softly, her kind face creased with emotion. "What you did for these children, it's changed their whole future. They talk about you every day." Amir tugged on Claire's sleeve, bouncing with excitement. "I made something for you." He ran to get his backpack, the same worn backpack from the plane, but now decorated with colorful stickers of superheroes and animals. From inside, he pulled out several pieces of paper, handling them with careful pride. "These are my drawings," he explained, spreading them across the coffee table with meticulous care. There were pictures of their journey, the plane, the safe house, the docks. Each one captured a moment of their shared story in vivid crayon colors. But what made Claire's breath catch was the last drawing, a figure wearing a flowing cape, with Claire's curly hair and kind smile, standing tall against a bright blue sky. "That's you," Amir said proudly, pointing to the caped figure. "My superhero, see? You're helping people fly to safety." Layla joined them on the couch, wrapping an arm around her brother's shoulders. "We consider you family now," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us our lives back. You gave us hope again." Claire tried to speak, but tears welled in her eyes, blurring the drawings before her. Amir climbed into her lap and gave her a tight hug, his small arms strong and sure. "Don't cry," he whispered, patting her cheek. "Happy tears are okay though, Mrs. Chen says that too." The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the scene and creating dancing shadows on the walls. Claire watched as Amir showed her more drawings, his hands animated as he described each one with growing confidence in his English. Layla shared her dreams of helping other children like themselves, her voice strong and determined, already sounding like the capable social worker she hoped to become. As the day drew to a close, Claire stood at the door for final goodbyes, her heart full to bursting. Amir wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing his face into her sweater. "You're my hero," he whispered, his voice muffled but clear. Claire knelt down to his level, her eyes shining with tears and love. "And you're mine," she replied softly, holding him close. "You both are." Claire sat in her dimly lit study, the soft glow of her laptop screen illuminating her determined face. Tabs filled with anti-trafficking organizations crowded her browser as she took careful notes, her teacher's instinct for organization showing through in her neat bullet points. Her coffee had grown cold, forgotten hours ago as she immersed herself in research. "There has to be a way to help more children like Amir," she whispered to herself, circling one particular organization that specialized in awareness training. She added another star beside a program that focused on airport and travel industry education. 3 days later, Claire stood at a podium in a community center, her hands steady on the wooden surface as she faced the crowd. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls. "I met Amir on what should have been a routine flight," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I had no idea that moment would change both our lives forever." The audience listened intently as Claire shared their story, carefully omitting sensitive details while conveying the urgency of awareness. She described the hand signals that had alerted the flight crew, explaining how ordinary people could recognize signs of trafficking. Her voice grew passionate as she detailed the small signs that anyone might notice in their daily lives. "We can't look away," she urged, her eyes scanning the attentive faces before her. "These children need us to be brave enough to notice, to act, to care. Each one of us has the power to make a difference." After her speech, people gathered around her, sharing their own stories and asking how they could help. A young mother wiped tears from her eyes as she thanked Claire, clutching a pamphlet about warning signs to watch for. Others signed up for volunteer training, their faces set with purpose. That evening, as Claire checked her email, a message caught her eye. The subject line read, "You changed my life, Mrs. Whitman." Her cursor hovered over it for a moment before she clicked. "Dear Mrs. Whitman," the email began, "you probably don't remember me. I was in your class 12 years ago. I was the quiet kid who always sat in the back, but you noticed me. You saw when I was struggling and took the time to help. Today I'm a teacher myself, and I try to see the kids others might miss, just like you did. Thank you for showing me what it means to really care." Claire touched her screen gently, memories flooding back of the shy student who'd blossomed under her guidance. She glanced at her desk, where a framed photo showed Amir and Layla smiling broadly, their arms around each other at their favorite park. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, determination clear in her voice. She turned back to her laptop, ready to plan her next presentation. Claire stood in Detective Morales' office, her fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his desk. Morning sunlight streamed through the dusty blinds, casting long shadows across case files and coffee cups. The air smelled of stale coffee and printer paper, a scent she'd come to associate with progress and frustration in equal measure. "We've made significant progress," Morales said, sliding a thick folder across his desk. The manila envelope was stuffed with documents, photos, and transcripts. "Thanks to the logbook, we've arrested 6 high-ranking members of the network. But..." He paused, rubbing his tired eyes, dark circles betraying countless sleepless nights. "The legal process is complex. International jurisdictions, mountains of paperwork." Claire leaned forward, her expression determined, hands gripping the edge of the desk. "How many more victims are still out there?" "Too many," Morales admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of unsolved cases. "We're working with Interpol to track down leads in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Each arrest gives us new information, but these networks are like hydras, cut off one head, and 2 more appear," Claire finished, her jaw set. She thought of Amir's haunted eyes, of Layla's quiet strength. "I want regular updates, Detective. Weekly, if possible. We can't let any of these criminals slip through the cracks." Morales nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "You have my word." As Claire left the precinct, she noticed a crowd gathering on the steps. About 20 people held signs with messages like, "Stop human trafficking" and "Protect our children." Their voices carried across the plaza, passionate but peaceful, echoing off the stone walls of the building. A woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes approached Claire. Her weathered hands clutched a stack of flyers. "Would you like to join us? We're pushing for stronger anti-trafficking legislation." Claire took in the determined faces around her, ordinary people fighting for extraordinary change. Mothers, fathers, teachers, students, all united by a common cause. The woman handed her a sign, and Claire felt its weight in her hands. Not just the physical weight, but the responsibility it represented. "We meet every Tuesday," another activist added, a young man with a messenger bag covered in advocacy pins. We write letters to legislators, organize awareness campaigns, support survivors. Claire gripped the sign tighter, thinking of Amir and Layla, of all the others still waiting to be found. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'd like to help." She stepped into the line of protesters, raising her voice with theirs. The morning sun warmed her face as she stood shoulder to shoulder with these dedicated advocates. Knowing she had found another way to make a difference, the chorus of voices grew stronger, a testament to the power of collective action and unwavering hope. Claire sat on the comfortable couch in Amir and Layla's foster home, watching sunlight stream through delicate lace curtains. The house felt warm and welcoming, filled with the soft sounds of children playing in the backyard and the distant chime of wind bells swaying in the gentle breeze. "Wait here," Amir called out, his eyes bright with excitement and a hint of mischief. He dashed from the living room, his sock-covered feet sliding slightly on the hardwood floor, nearly bumping into a side table in his rush. Claire smiled, noting how much more at ease he seemed compared to their first meeting on the plane, when he'd barely been able to meet her eyes. When he returned, Amir clutched something behind his back, shifting from foot to foot with nervous energy. "I made this for you," he said shyly, presenting her with a carefully folded piece of paper. His hands were steady now, so different from the trembling fingers that had once gripped his backpack like a lifeline during their escape. Claire gently unfolded the paper, her heart warming at what she found. There, drawn in vibrant colors and careful strokes, was a detailed illustration of herself as a superhero. She wore a flowing cape that seemed to catch an invisible wind, its edges decorated with tiny stars and swirls. Her face showed the same determination she'd felt during their rescue mission, and a gentle smile played at her lips. Every detail was crafted with care, from the symbol on her chest, a heart wrapped in protective wings, to the confident stance and the tiny people she was helping in the background. "Look," Amir pointed excitedly, bouncing slightly on his toes. "You're saving people, just like you saved us. See the cape? It's magic. It helps you find kids who need help." Claire laughed softly, touched by the thoughtful gift and the imagination behind it. "This is beautiful, Amir. You're quite the artist. I love all the little details you included." Layla, who had been watching from nearby with a gentle smile, moved closer to join them. "He's been drawing every day," she shared, resting a protective hand on her brother's shoulder and giving it a gentle squeeze. "It helps him express what he's feeling." Her eyes met Claire's, filled with deep gratitude and understanding. "You're our angel, Claire. You gave us our lives back, and we'll never forget that." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes as warmth spread through her chest. "I'll always be here for both of you," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "Whenever you need me, day or night, I'm just a phone call away." The drawing trembled slightly in her hands as she looked at it again, taking in every loving detail. The superhero version of herself stood tall and unafraid, exactly how Amir saw her, a beacon of hope in dark times. It was a powerful reminder of the impact one person could have on another's life, and how small acts of courage could create ripples of change. Later that evening, Claire carefully placed the drawing in a simple wooden frame and set it on her desk at home, where she could see it while she worked. She stepped back, smiling at how the last rays of sunset caught the bright colors of Amir's artwork, making them glow like stained glass. The superhero's cape seemed to shimmer with life, a testament to the enduring power of courage and compassion, and the unbreakable bonds formed in the darkest of times. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the microphone backstage at the Metropolitan Convention Center. The murmur of hundreds of voices filtered through the heavy curtain, reminding her of ocean waves. She smoothed her blazer for the 10th time, her mouth dry as sandpaper, and adjusted the small silver pin shaped like a butterfly that Amir had given her for luck. Zara appeared beside her, looking polished and confident in a navy suit that perfectly matched her determined expression. She squeezed Claire's shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. "You've got this," she said with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Just speak from your heart, like we practiced. Remember why we're here." Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs completely, Claire stepped onto the brightly lit stage. The sea of faces before her made her pulse quicken, and the spotlight felt warm on her skin. She cleared her throat and began speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word like a flower unfurling in the sun. 6 months ago, I boarded a plane that changed my life forever. I was just a retired school principal heading on vacation when I noticed a frightened young boy. Claire's voice carried through the hushed auditorium as she recounted meeting Amir, the harrowing rescue, and the joy of reuniting him with Layla. Her words painted vivid pictures of fear turned to hope, of darkness giving way to light. Tissues emerged from purses as Claire described Amir's first smile in his new foster home, how it lit up his whole face and made his eyes sparkle. Several audience members dabbed at their eyes when she shared about his superhero drawing, carefully preserved now in a frame on her office wall. One small act of attention, one moment of choosing to care instead of looking away, that's all it takes to potentially save a life, she concluded, her voice thick with emotion. Zara took the stage next, her presence commanding attention like a beacon of strength. She detailed her experiences infiltrating the trafficking network and the gut-wrenching decision to expose it, her hands gripping the podium with quiet intensity. I saw too many children like Amir and Layla, she said firmly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. I couldn't stay silent anymore. None of us should. The applause was deafening as both women finished speaking, rolling through the auditorium like thunder. People rose to their feet, their faces shining with emotion and purpose, some calling out words of support. After the presentation, a crowd gathered around their table, forming a circle of hope and determination. A teacher with kind eyes wanted to start an awareness program at her school. A businessman in an expensive suit offered to fund survivor support services, already pulling out his checkbook. A college student with bright blue hair asked about volunteer opportunities, her notebook filled with careful notes. Claire felt overwhelmed by the response, but in the best possible way. Her chest tight with gratitude, she watched Zara expertly handle questions and share resources, amazed at how far they'd both come since that terrifying night at the shipping yard. Each person who approached them represented another chance to make a difference. As they packed up their materials, Claire's heart felt full to bursting. "We're making a difference," she said softly, carefully storing away the thank you cards they'd received. Zara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. "And we're just getting started. This is only the beginning." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the foster home as Claire pulled into the driveway, carefully balancing a chocolate cake in one hand and a stack of wrapped books in the other. Colorful balloons bobbed gently in the breeze, tied to the mailbox and front porch railing, their shadows dancing across the well-tended flower beds that lined the walkway. "Claire!" Amir's excited voice rang out as he burst through the front door, his face beaming with the kind of pure happiness that made her heart swell. He wrapped his arms around her waist, nearly causing her to drop the cake. His grip was strong and sure, so different from the tentative touches of a year ago. Layla followed close behind, her dark eyes sparkling with joy, her long hair neatly braided for the special occasion. Inside, the house hummed with celebration. The foster parents had decorated the living room with streamers and happy birthday banners in bright blues and yellows, Amir's favorite colors. The coffee table overflowed with snacks and drinks, and the delicious smell of fresh-baked cookies filled the air, mixing with the sounds of children's laughter and excited chatter. As children played party games in the backyard, their gleeful shouts drifting through the open windows, Layla pulled Claire aside to the quiet kitchen. "I've been thinking about my future," she said, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, a habit that surfaced whenever she felt nervous but determined. "I want to help kids like us. I want to be a social worker." Claire squeezed Layla's hand, feeling the warmth of her conviction. "You'll be amazing at it. I'll help you research schools and scholarships as whatever you need. You've already got such a big heart for helping others." Layla's eyes welled with tears, but her smile remained steady. "Thank you for believing in us, for everything you've done." Later, as everyone gathered for cake, Amir tugged on Claire's sleeve with gentle insistence. "I wrote something," he said shyly, pulling out a folded piece of paper covered in his careful handwriting. "Can I read it?" Claire nodded encouragingly, and Amir cleared his throat. In careful, precise English, He began reading his essay about resilience. His voice grew stronger with each sentence, filling the room with words of hope and determination. The other children sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently to their friend's story. Claire watched him with pride, remembering the frightened boy from the plane who could barely meet her eyes. Now he stood tall, surrounded by love and support, his future bright with possibility. His shoulders were straight, his chin lifted with quiet confidence. Beside him, Layla beamed at her brother's accomplishment, her own dreams of helping others taking shape in her heart. The foster parents brought out the cake, topped with 13 candles that flickered like stars, as everyone clapped for Amir's reading. Laughter and chatter filled the room as the children clamored for slices, their faces glowing in the light of the birthday candles. Someone started singing "Happy Birthday," and soon the whole room joined in, their voices rising in joyful harmony. As the party continued, Claire watched Amir and Layla playing with their friends, their joy infectious and pure. She noticed how they moved with ease among their peers, no longer carrying the weight of fear on their shoulders. When it was time to leave, she hugged them both tightly, breathing in the scent of chocolate cake and happiness. "You two are unstoppable," she said, happy tears glistening in her eyes, knowing in her heart that they would indeed change the world in their own special ways. Claire settled into her window seat, clutching her passport just as she had done a year ago. But this time, everything felt different. Her hands were steady, her heart full of purpose rather than trepidation. She was heading to Greece to work with an organization helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. As the plane lifted off, Claire watched the familiar New York skyline shrink beneath her. Her mind drifted to that life-changing flight with Amir. She could still picture him, small, frightened, clutching his backpack. Now he was thriving, filling sketchbooks with colorful drawings and earning top marks in English class. The sight of his progress filled her with pride and joy. The thought of Amir and Layla's transformation brought tears to her eyes. Just last week, Layla had called to share her acceptance into a youth leadership program. "You showed me that one person can make a difference," Layla had said. "Now I want to do the same for others." Her voice had been filled with excitement and hope, a stark contrast to the desperation Claire remembered. Looking at the clouds drifting past her window, Claire felt a deep sense of connection to the world below. Every city, every country held stories like Amir's, people waiting for someone to notice, to care, to act. Her retirement had become more meaningful than she could have imagined, a new chapter dedicated to making a real difference. Claire pulled out her notebook, filled with contacts and resources she'd gathered over the past year. Each page represented a step forward in her mission to help trafficking survivors. She'd learned so much since that first encounter with Amir, about the complexities of trafficking networks, about the power of community action, about her own capacity for courage. Every lesson had been a stepping stone, guiding her to this moment. The plane climbed higher and Claire watched sunlight break through the clouds. She thought about all the lives still waiting to be touched, all the stories yet to unfold. Her own journey had taught her that even small actions could create profound change. The warmth of the sun seemed to promise new beginnings and endless possibilities. "Would you like something to drink?" the flight attendant asked, pausing beside her seat. "Yes, thank you," Claire replied, smiling as she remembered how different this interaction felt compared to her anxious first flight. Now she saw every conversation as an opportunity to raise awareness, to make connections to help create change. Each moment was a chance to extend her mission further. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. The journey before her was bound to be challenging, but the thought of making a difference gave her all the strength she needed. If you enjoyed the story of Claire, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.